Now the next thing I'd like to talk to you about are tuples. And tuples are very, very similar to lists in that they are ordered groupings of similar objects. The syntax for creating a tuple within Python is also very similar to creating a list. In fact, the only difference that we see in creating a tuple within Python in the syntax is that we're going to use parentheses instead of square brackets in order to create a tuple. All of the things we talked about for lists regarding indexing, slicing, and concatenating, all of those things still work precisely for tuples exactly the way that they would work for lists. Although it's important to note that we still use square brackets when we're doing that indexing and slicing, even though tuples are specified with parentheses. So in the example that I've given below, I've created a Python tuple that I've named Fibonacci, and it has these particular values in this order. I could access the fourth index inside this list, counting 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and this would print out a value of 5 to my screen. Similarly, I could take a slice of my Fibonacci tuple here, and I could use my square brackets with an omitted starting value and a non-included ending value to get the first 4 values of my tuple, and this would give me 1, 1, 2, 3, the 0, 1, 2, and 3 spots of that Fibonacci tuple. And just as before, I could concatenate and add values to the end of my list by taking the current value of Fibonacci and adding to the end of it a 21 and a 34. So very, very similar to what's going on with lists. So similar, in fact, that you might say, what on earth is even different about them? The main difference between tuples and lists in Python is that tuples are immutable, even more so than our atomic data types. For example, if I attempt to access the first entry in my Fibonacci tuple, which I can easily do with the syntax on the left-hand side here, but if I attempt to change that value, to reassign a value here, Python will produce a type error, which says that the tuple object does not support item assignment. So once I've created that first value in my Fibonacci tuple, I am not allowed to change it with this syntax like I could do for a list. Similarly, I cannot delete values or remove values from a tuple ever. So in a sense, we're allowed to concatenate tuples to make them stretch, but we are not allowed to shrink them at all. If I use that reserved word delete on a tuple or attempt to use a remove method, I will get different types of errors. The first will say that the tuple object does not support deleting things, and the second will say that a tuple object does not have a remove method. All of these things will create errors within Python. Further, although concatenation of tuples is allowed with this plus equals syntax, append is not a method of the tuple data type. And so I would get the exact same error using a Fibonacci.append right here that I would in the remove situation. I'd get an error that says tuple object has no attribute, append. So if I want to add to tuples, I have to use the plus equals syntax. Just out of curiosity, the count method that we saw for lists does work for tuples. And if you wanted to know the official methods of the tuple data type, I would again suggest turning to that official Python documentation to see what methods are allowed and what methods are not allowed, and what parameters and arguments need to be passed to those methods. And all of these things are big drawbacks to tuples within Python. So much so that you might be wondering, why on earth do I even need tuples? And the answer is that there's some complications behind the scenes where sometimes Python will only let you do things with immutable objects, and so we'll have to take lists and convert them to tuples, or vice versa. For now, I'm leaving the introduction of tuples as this is just a surprise thing that we might need later, and let's learn about it and know that it exists, while very frequently, particularly at this beginning stage, we'll be favoring lists over tuples.